السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. ستكون هذه المحاضرة باللغة الإنجليزية، وذلك لمن يرغب بالاستماع بالعربية يرجى الضغط على علامة الترجمة في الأسفل. Welcome everyone to a new event organized by the Asian Studies Program at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies. I'm Mohammed Ramazan, a research associate at the center. I will be moderating today's event. Our lecture for today will last roughly from 35 to 45 minutes. I will encourage along to write your questions in the designated box down the screen, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of the lecture. In today's event titled EU-China Relation at Crossroads, Recent Developments and Future Prospects, we seek to focus on the recent developments and prospects of European-Chinese relation following the breakout of the war between Russia and Ukraine and its international consequences. We will aim to discuss these subjects and its implication for the Gulf region. I'm honored to present our distinguished guest for today, Dr. Julia Gugol, who is a postdoctoral researcher and lecturer, and also chair for international relations at the University of Freiburg. She is an associate fellow at the Center for Applied Research in partnership with Orient, and she was also one of the visiting researchers at the King Faisal Center. Dr. Go's PhD dissertation focused on China-EU security relations in the Middle East. She received her master in political science and second degree in Asian and Oriental studies from the University of Bonn. And she also has a bachelor's degree in social sciences from the University of Dusseldorf. Her research interests include EU-China relations, Chinese foreign and security policy, European Middle East policy, China's roles in the Middle East, global power shifts, transformation of irregular armed actors and social movement. Her first monograph, the EU-China Security Paradox Cooperation Against All Odds, was just published in January 2022. She has also published and co-published several articles concerning China foreign policy, EU-China cooperation, and their security in the Middle East, in several peer-reviewed journals, including the European Review of International Relations, Chinese, and also the Chinese Journal of the Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies, and the Journal of Common Market Studies. She also contributed to several articles concerning South-South cooperation, China-Maghreb relations, and small states in the EU. She has also done research within China, Lebanon, Palestine, and Colombia. She has a teaching experience in MA and BA seminars on subjects related to conflict analysis, international relations, political sciences, Yemen, academics in post-conflict reconstructions. Beside that, she speaks German as a native, in addition to English, Spanish, Chinese, and basic French and Arabic. She also contributed to different analysis pieces and views published on several online and platforms and think tanks websites. I would like to call Dr. Julia over to share her views and enlighten us about how and in what ways EU-China relations developed and interacted with each other in the Middle East in particular, especially following the outbreak of the Russian-Ukraine war and its potential repercussions on the Gulf, especially. Dr. Julia, please share with us your insights.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mohammed, for this very kind and very encompassing introduction. And many thanks, of course, also to the King Faisal Center for hosting me today. It is a really great honor and pleasure to be here today and to talk about a topic that is the core of my research for almost 5 years now, and that is gaining a lot of attention these days. So I'm very happy to see that there's so much interest in EU-China relations at the moment. It would have been great to meet all of you in person, obviously, but I think I'm very confident that 2 years into the pandemic, we are all used to Zoom, so we can have a very good and fruitful discussion, although we don't really see each other. I will try to share my screen now. Let me check. Okay, you should be able to see my screen now without notes, just the presentation, right?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So I did not realize this when we scheduled the day for this lecture almost 4 weeks ago, but I think the timing to talk about EU-China relations today, it couldn't have been better, because just last Friday on April 1st, the 23rd EU-China summit took place that made very visible certain trends in EU-China relations that had already been ongoing for quite some years now, but were really accelerated not only by the COVID pandemic, but of course, especially by the recent war in Ukraine, that provides a major stress test, if not the biggest stress test for EU-China relations. And 2021, I wrote that in the short summary for this lecture, has already been a very tough year for EU-China relations. And 2022 was actually supposed to be a turning point. And I think it's fair to say now that it is a turning point, but definitely not for the better. And the rather frosty meeting last Friday has made really clear how the two sides are struggling to recalibrate their bilateral relations. So this is the overall scene that I am embedding this lecture in. So my input today, as Mohammed has rightly said, is entitled EU-China Relations at a Crossroads, Recent Developments and Future Prospects. And I will try to live up to this promise, as I think that there is enough to discuss, even if we focus only at the past few weeks. My lecture is structured in 4 parts. Basically, I will start by outlining very briefly, don't worry, no historic overview, very briefly the evolution of EU-China relations and the development from a comprehensive strategic partnership in 2003 to a partnership that is by now also interwoven with very deep tensions and increasing systemic rivalries. I will then focus on the most recent developments and give my 2 cents on the outcomes of the EU-China summit that took place last Friday. I will present 3 interpretations of what has been discussed and how has it been discussed, and then also focus, of course, on EU-China relations amidst the Ukraine war. From that, I will very briefly point to challenges and opportunities for future engagement, and conclude with what I think might be potential implications of this current recalibration of EU-China relations for the Gulf region. Now, to interpret the direction in which EU-China relations are moving, it is necessary to understand where they come from. Since the establishment of EU-China diplomatic relations and the conclusion of the first official China policy paper by the EU in 1995, they have been caught in what I often call a love-hate relationship, in which they cannot really live without each other, but they cannot live with each other and really constantly struggle to find a way to engage with the respective other. And I think one thing that we need to keep in mind when talking about EU-China relations is that this is a very peculiar relationship, because it takes place between a state and a regional polity, albeit one that has developed many of the trappings of statehood. But still, the EU is a very hybrid actor, and the coexistence of European and national foreign policies make it a very unique and often also very difficult player when seeking to relate to a traditional state such as China. Because despite the pooling of sovereignty on the EU level, foreign and security policy is still very strongly a prerogative of the individual member states. And this already points to one of the main challenges the EU faces in its China policy, which is finding one common voice towards the People's Republic. Not only in its China policy, by the way, this is the struggle the EU faces in any of its foreign policy decisions. Now, in general, we can distinguish between 4 phases of EU-China relations. The heyday was certainly the conclusion of the comprehensive strategic partnership in 2003, which marked the beginning for a very short honeymoon period that slowly transformed into deepening frictions. And this has been the tendency until today. And for the sake of timing, I will only briefly focus on the very last, the 4th phase from 2019 onwards. This phase was kicked off by the publication of a very strategic and very important document on behalf of the EU, the so-called EU-China Strategic Outlook, published in March 2019, which contains the probably most fitting description of what roles China plays for the EU. And this document says, and I quote, that there is a growing appreciation in Europe that the balance of challenges and opportunities presented by China has shifted so that Europe's approach also needs to be more realistic, more assertive, and more multifaceted. And this was a shift in terms of language in comparison to previous policy papers that were much more cooperation oriented and maybe even a little bit more naive in terms of what China can be for the EU. And more specifically, this strategic outlook defines 3 roles that China plays for the EU, saying that China is an important cooperation partner, an economic competitor, especially when it comes to technological innovation and leadership, as well as a systemic rival promoting alternative models of governance. And especially this last role, the systemic rival, has become very prevalent today. And these 3 roles show already quite clearly how difficult and complex EU-China relations are, because on the one hand, they are deeply intertwined in what Cohen and Nye have called complex interdependencies, but at the same time, they remain highly divided regarding the principles, the basic principles of foreign and security policy making, models of governance, normative aspirations, etc. So this was the status quo in 2019. 2020 was then meant to be a year of progress in EU-China relations. Prevailing differences were to be addressed and decisive progress was to be made. And especially against the backdrop of the German presidency of the EU Council, preparations had started early to enable an unprecedented gathering of all EU heads of state and government and their respective Chinese counterparts in the EU-China Summit 2020. But instead, what happened was that 2020 brought to the fore quite a degree of disillusion and disenchantment. And already the 2020 EU-China Summit did not conclude with any remarkable deliverables. But instead, China's hardline stances on the democratic movement in Hong Kong overstrained EU-China relations back then. And then, of course, also the outbreak of the COVID pandemic further put the already loosening bond in a tough spot. This is also why a lot of hopes were put in the negotiations of the so-called Comprehensive Agreement on Investment that should create a level playing field between the EU and China, granting the EU enhanced access to Chinese markets in sectors like health services, chemicals, electric vehicles, telecom. It should also enhance legal protection for EU investments in China, eliminate equity caps, ease requirements for joint ventures, etc., etc. And the European Commission back then called this agreement a booster for future EU-China relations. And you can imagine how hard a bummer it was when the ratification of this agreement was then put on ice in 2021 because of the deepening political tensions, and relations have not really recovered from that until today. Now that I've set the scene a little bit, I directly want to jump to the most recent developments in EU-China relations. And as I said before, this lecture could not have been more timely because last week on Friday, April 1st, this is not an April's Fool, the 23rd EU-China Summit took place. This is an annual meeting on the highest level. Last year, it had already been postponed because of an escalation of trade and human rights disputes following the EU sanctions over Xinjiang and putting on ice the ratification of the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. This year, the meeting took place, but already in the run-up to the meetings, it was very much overshadowed by the disagreements over the Ukraine war, the disagreements over the role China has played and is playing vis-a-vis the regime in Moscow, the EU's criticism that China does not more openly or even at all distance itself from the regime in Moscow or condemn the actions that are taking place. So before the meeting took place, in the official rhetorics, China very much tried to emphasize the potential for general cooperation, while EU leaders made it very clear that their top priority would be to discuss how to end the war in Ukraine together, but also how to convince China into playing a more active mediating role in this conflict. So the summit already started in a very chilly and tense environment with very high expectations from both sides, but also expectations that, as we have seen, were not, could not be fulfilled. And also the statements that then followed the summit in the past days, they keep coming in, made very clear that it was a rather frosty meeting. And I think that there are basically three major interpretations that we can take away from the meeting. The first is systemic rivalry seems to be the new reality in EU-China relations. The second is that the war in Ukraine has shifted the relations between the EU and China to the extent that this could be a very decisive moment for where relations will go in the future. It's definitely a turning point. China's reputation in Europe is on the line. And I think the ongoing war in Ukraine has the potential to turn the already very troubled China-EU relationship into an inoperable one. And the third interpretation is that the EU, we have seen that in the discussions in the summit, the EU is putting its own interests now more robustly on the table. It is rethinking its approach to foreign and security policy and also its own role within this. It has somewhere found its geopolitical muscles that it possesses. It has started flexing them. It's small muscles, but they are existent. And is putting its own interests more robustly on the table. One could argue that, as always, the EU comes a bit late to the party in doing this, but this is new, and I think this bears a huge potential for a lot of foreign policy issues, not only the EU's position and relationship with China. Now, on my first interpretation, why do I think systemic rivalry is the new reality in EU-China relations right now, and probably also for the near and foreseeable future? First of all, there are a lot of unresolved and maybe even unresolvable bilateral disputes in EU-China relations. As I said before, 2021 has been the most difficult year so far for the bilateral partnership. And the list of issues that Beijing and Brussels have been at odds over in the last couple of years is not shortening, but it's getting longer and longer, including human rights abuses in Xinjiang, the imposition of Hong Kong's national security law, but also the economic coercion that China is applying towards Lithuania after Lithuania's decision to open a Taiwanese representative office. And also the EU's sanctions imposed on a Chinese entity and individuals accused of human rights abuses in China's western province of Xinjiang, and China's retaliatory sanctions against selected EU parliamentarians, journalists, and research institutions who were outspoken on issues that China considers sensitive, adds to this, of course. And until today, both sanctions have not been lifted, and the EU-China summit did not bring about any deliverables or any changes regarding these sanctions. So this is very much adding up to the systemic rivalry and to the tensions between the two sides. Also, the failed ratification of the comprehensive agreement on investments could not be resolved. So it is highly unlikely to make a comeback in the foreseeable future, although there might be two small windows of opportunity for a revival of this agreement. But I will talk about this at a later stage in my presentation. Concerning the second takeaway my second takeaway of the EU-China summit, the Ukraine war is a turning point. I think it is hard to overstate the momentous impact that the invasion has had on European perceptions of security and foreign policy. The German Chancellor Scholz very pointedly said that this is, I quote, a turning point in history, a Zeitenwende, for all of you who speak German, and let alone Germany as well as the rest of Europe, signaling the will to step up investments in their militaries is in fact, or could be a game changer, I think, because this would have been unthinkable in the past years. The war has also brought about bigger changes because it has added up to a revival of NATO that had already been declared brain dead by Macron in 2019, and that had further been discredited and destabilized by the chaos of the US exit from Afghanistan, but that has now all of a sudden formed a united front since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th. So of course, it is very hard to predict how all these things will evolve amid the current high emotions in the context of the war. But at least I completely subscribe to this idea of this war being a global turning point for a lot of alliances and partnerships worldwide, not only EU-China partnership, of course. But for the EU-China partnership, this war, as I said in the beginning, is probably the biggest stress test, because in a way that we have never seen before, it demonstrates where and how interests and values of the two sides diverge. Be it the understanding of what has caused the war in the first place, the root causes, the arguments Russia has brought about. Be it the assessment of the potential global implications of this war. Be it discussions about potential ways out of the conflict, about conflict resolution. On all these topics, the European and Chinese leaderships have expressed very different positions during the summit. Of course, going beyond rhetoric endorsement of saying there needs to be a peaceful solution. That was the baseline, and of course they agreed on that. But besides that, the positions were very, very different. And already in the run-up to the meeting, when the agenda was drafted, these clashing positions became very clear, because the phrasing of the agenda proposed by the EU, and I quote, "The engagement of the international community to support Ukraine and the dramatic humanitarian crisis created by Russia's aggression," end of quote. That was the suggested talking point, or the suggested topic, runs very much in counter to China's official line and made it very difficult to find common ground during the summit. And this is, of course, at least in my understanding, partly due to the diverging interests and values, but also partly due to misunderstanding, I would say. Of course, the European leadership, for example, does not understand why the Chinese leadership has not yet condemned Russia as the main aggressor or as the aggressor against Ukraine, or even openly distanced itself from Moscow. But from a Chinese perspective, I would say, we can also hear repeated criticism that the European leadership, in turn, does not necessarily understand what is at stake for China. Because from a Chinese viewpoint, the expansion of NATO in the East, in Eastern Europe, for example, is often compared with recent geopolitical maneuvers by the US and its allies in China's Asia-Pacific neighborhood, particularly concerning the Indo-Pacific strategies and the emerging alliances of Quad. So in this sense, China perceives NATO's expansion, if we subscribe to that argument, as one of the key factors among the root causes for the current conflict. And of course, this is clashing with the European position. I have written this book on EU-China security relations that Mohammed so nicely advertised in the beginning already. Thank you, by the way. And one of the key findings, after comparing 3 very different case studies on security and EU's and China's engagement, is that cooperation between the two sides is very unlikely if the EU and China do not share or fail to agree on a common problem understanding or threat perception. And the current conflict has shown this once more, I think. I've read a very interesting article in The Diplomat, I think, these days, that also makes this argument. I'm very happy to share it with you afterwards. So to go back to the summit, all that could be reached during the discussions last Friday was that President Xi Jinping said China would support the EU playing a leading role in the peace talks and also support dialogue between Europe, Russia, the United States, and NATO. But beyond that, there was no concrete commitment to cooperation, and the exchanged views, as I said, were very clearly opposing. One EU official said after the exchange on Ukraine on Friday that, and again I quote, "The systemic rival box is now full to overflowing," end of quote. And I think that is very telling and goes back to my first interpretation that systemic rivalry is in fact the new reality. And also just this morning, I have been reading some recent developments that happened today when I prepared this presentation. Just this morning in the European Parliament, Ursula von der Leyen made a statement saying that nobody can be neutral when faced with such naked aggression against civilians, reacting to China's lacking condemnation of the atrocities and the cruelties that happened in Bucha. What we have seen in the past few days, though, is that Beijing has even doubled down on pro-Russian talking points in its official rhetoric. So I think hoping for the Chinese leadership to overtly condemn Russia or even pressing Vladimir Putin behind the scenes, as some observers have suggested, is at best a wishful thinking. I think we cannot be naive on that. But at the same time, Josep Borrell made clear that only China could effectively mediate in this conflict. And this makes it a kind of a make it or break it moment for the EU, because if the EU fails to come together now and to convey a strong message, there is the risk that China might absorb the wrong message. So I think it can be expected that attempts to convince Beijing to take a more critical stance on Moscow's endeavors will continue. And the only way I now see for EU-China relations to somehow, at least somehow, manage their diverging positions towards Ukraine and at the same time make a concerted action for peace talks is to focus on the very small things that they can actually agree on, which is the will or the wish to enable a ceasefire and to stop fighting, to create an international environment that is conducive for peace talks, and coordinating within the UN framework to prepare for security assurances and arrangements after the war. This is the only way I now see for EU-China relations to manage their diverging positions. Now over to my third takeaway or my third interpretation of what the EU-China summit has told us about this bilateral relationship. I think what was visible quite clearly also already in the run-up to the meeting is, as I said, that the EU is now putting its own interests more robustly to the forefront than before and has flexed some of the geopolitical muscles that it has so often in the past shied away from using. The muscles have been there also in the past, but they were not used. And the EU is definitely a very slow mover. It always takes a while until the EU acts, which of course is partly due to the huge coordination and negotiation effort that is required to align 27 member states' opinions to one common EU position. But once the EU has started moving, she can be very persistent along her path and continues to go into this very direction. So I think that the Ukraine war has made the EU rethink its approach to foreign and security policy and also its own role within this. It has demonstrated unity, a unity that we have very seldom seen on behalf of the EU in the past decade, probably. And I have no doubt that this has somehow strengthened its self-consciousness. And this was also visible during the EU-China summit. Now, I promised to talk not only about the challenges and what is deteriorating in EU-China relations, but also about the opportunities. And of course, despite the fact that all signs now point to increased systemic rivalry, this does not mean that EU-China relations are deemed to escalate into deeper tensions in all policy fields. There's also a lot of potential for cooperation on certain topics. And I think it is equally important to flag the potential for cooperation as it is to make explicit the divergences that prevail. And we also want to have some kind of positive or optimistic outlook, at least on some issues. As I said in the beginning, the EU and China are bound in complex interdependencies, and they are very highly entangled, especially regarding trade. In 2021, China was the third largest partner for EU exports of goods and the largest partner for EU imports of goods. And this already makes very clear the dilemma that I've pointed to right in the beginning, that there's no way for the EU and China not to engage with each other and not to continue talks, because the trade volume being exchanged between them is so high. So despite this overall context of bilateral angst, and despite the political tensions that have increased, both sides have or still are very keen to try and stress areas of common interest and cooperation. And these include the importance of an open and multilateral trading system and tackling climate change, to name the two most important policy fields or topics, so to speak. On the first, the multilateral trading system, I would say that there is still hope from both sides that the comprehensive agreement on investment might get ratified at some point, despite the growing opposition also from the Biden administration. One might argue that the prospects of this happening are growing lower and lower, but I think there might be two very small windows of opportunity for a potential revival of this agreement this year. The first would be following the French presidential elections taking place soon, and the second would be this autumn's National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, at which Xi Jinping is expected to secure a third term as General Secretary. But again, it is more probable that the investment deal will not progress in the nearest future, and the question of whether it stands any chance of ratification anytime soon, I think will hinge upon Beijing's next steps regarding Russia. On the second topic, where we can have a more positive outlook, or where there are better prospects for future cooperation, is combating climate change, which is a topic on which the EU and China already have a very fruitful history of cooperation that was also kicked off when the US President Trump decided to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, causing increased international attention for the EU and China to kind of solve this agreement, being two of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases globally. So I'm really sure that in the future, despite all the tensions on the policy fields that I've already outlined, we will see the EU and China deepening cooperation on developing a cost-effective, low-carbon economy. Both share a vision of a prosperous, energy-secure future in a stable climate, and also recognize the need to collaborate with each other to realize this agenda. And already in 2015, they have agreed and developed quite a path for this, to intensify cooperation in domestic mitigation policies, carbon markets, low carbon cities, greenhouse gas emissions from the aviation and maritime industries, and also hydrofluorocarbons. So in principle, despite the mounting tensions, both the EU and China can still gain from a deeper partnership on issues from trade to climate change. However, right now, politics may not allow for this, and a lot will depend on how the conflict in Ukraine develops and how far Beijing goes in deepening its support for Moscow. Now, to the end of my lecture, I would like to give you a very cautious assessment of potential implications of the changing EU-China relationship for the Gulf region. There would be a lot to say on China-Gulf, but also EU-Gulf relations, but I'm trying not to overstretch the topic of this lecture and just point towards some of the rather trilateral developments that are relevant here. I think these days are a very interesting momentum for both China-Gulf and EU-Gulf relations. We've seen a lot of developments back and forth in these two relationships in the past weeks, a lot of state visits. And overall, this has created what I would call a window of opportunity for all sides to rethink their relations. And the stakes resulting from EU-China tensions on the Ukraine issue could also be high for the Gulf region, not at least because the choices Xi Jinping makes are likely to determine whether some kind of new Cold War can be averted. And basically, there are three scenarios or 3 points that I would like to stress, or that I would like to conclude with, or 3 ideas rather. As we have already seen in the past weeks, the EU now has turned more towards Gulf countries as major energy producers. And I think in the upcoming UGCC action program, energy will most certainly feature very prominently. And this, of course, can have huge potentials, especially if the EU manages to deliver a robust message to the Gulf countries that a deeper energy partnership could pave the way not only for short-term cooperation, but for a long-term green transition. Also, as the conflict in Ukraine evolves and the Chinese and the European and the Gulf governments calibrate and recalibrate their responses to it, we can see unfolding the contours of what a new era of multipolarity might look like. And in the case of China, a Russia that is on the verge of becoming some kind of pariah state with a collapsed economy is not the strategic partner that Xi Jinping has likely envisioned Russia to be, or that he personally invested so much in cultivating. So it appears that Beijing's partnership with Russia, which is in principle very robust, does not compel China to support everything Moscow does. And this might lead to a stronger pivot to China's other strategic partners, also rich in oil and gas, namely the Gulf countries. I think the GCC is very vital for China's energy security, while China in turn, of course, provides GCC countries with a stable market for exports. So I think we might see a lot happening here in the future. And last but not least, a stronger EU that knows its position on the global stage, that is more autonomous, also maybe autonomous from the United States, that has more activeness, can be a more reliable and maybe even better partner for the Gulf countries as well. But of course, it's not up to me to judge this. Other people might be more outspoken on this. But as I said before, this time is really a turning point, and a lot depends on how the war in Ukraine will evolve. Every day there are new developments, and this is a very interesting, and I do not mean this normatively, of course, time to watch China and Europe, and also Europe in the world. So that's all from my side. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I could give you a little overview over recent developments and thereby spark a discussion. I'm very happy to stop talking now and engage in a joint discussion. I don't know actually if I will be able to see you on the screen once I stop sharing my screen, but I'm very happy to discuss and hear your own ideas also. And last but not least, a very small advertisement. I'm still new to this, but I was told that this is a good thing to do at the end of the lecture. So if you want to do some reading on EU-China relations with a focus on security, you are of course very welcome to purchase my new and first book, The EU-China Security Paradox, which is available at Bristol University Press, or just reach out to me for bilateral discussions that I'm always very happy to have. So here on the slide, you can find my mailing address and Twitter handle. So with that being said, thank you for listening and for providing me this platform to talk. And yeah, over to you again, Mohammed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia. You made a very thoughtful presentation about a very interesting subject concerning China-EU relation on one hand, and then the international repercussions of Ukraine and Russian wars, and then you shed light in the relation to the Gulf region. While I still wait to see some questions come from the audience, I would like to pose some questions to you, including what I think a relevant question to ask here related to the EU-China relation. When it comes to China, international audience find US-China has been intense in many ways for the past few years. Has it been the case for the EU-China relation? Has it been always intense, or has it only been intense in the past few, let's say 2 or 3 years, especially after the COVID-19?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very important question. You mean that whether there have been tensions before? I mean, I think in the past 2 or 3 years, tensions have increased quite significantly. US-China tensions have definitely been higher, and the EU has struggled also a lot to find its position between Beijing and Washington. There has been a lot of pressure from Washington also on the EU to follow its position to decouple from China, for example. But this has not taken place. But since the outbreak of COVID, and maybe even a little bit before, maybe starting in 2019, as I've outlined before, we have seen an increase in tensions in EU-China relations as well. As I said, not to the same degree as US-China tensions. There has been no trade war whatsoever, but tensions have increased, definitely. Yes.
Also, I would like to take another reference to your book in chapter 9. You had a very interesting title in which you refer to the US as the elephant in a room in relation to the EU-China security relation. Within this paradigm, do you think that EU still maintain independent foreign policy, especially in relation to China, EU-China security relationship, while it has this ongoing and warm relation with the US?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think the US is always the elephant in the room, and especially for EU-China relations, because as I said before, the EU has been struggling and still is struggling to find its own autonomous role in the world. And for a long time, one could have considered the EU being the smaller brother or smaller sister of the US, especially when it comes to security, because the EU per se is not a strong security actor. So for a long time, I think the EU has been kind of free riding on the US security guarantees. We've seen this in many world regions. So what I hope might happen from this rethinking of foreign and security policy that is taking place now, with the EU also reconsidering its own role, realizing that with a normative approach only one cannot do politics anymore, that this might change and that the EU might have a stronger role also in foreign and security policy specifically. But it's a long way to go there, and I think it will be a very hard struggle. Yes.
Thank you. You also made a reference to the outbreak of the Russian-Ukraine war. has made the security issue is more prominent in EU foreign policy making. Wouldn't you think that this increase of the issue of security in the EU would make EU-Chinese policy come together for a more security collaboration and development?
I might have answered this question differently 5 years ago when I started doing my PhD on EU-China security cooperation. I would have been more optimistic back then. I'm not so optimistic right now, because security is a policy field where it can be very difficult to cooperate if you have not the same, as I said, problem understanding or threat perception. And also with a lot of security issues, certain political values come attached, like territorial integrity, sovereignty, non-interference. And on a lot of these principles, the EU and China, they don't have the same position. So I think in general, EU-China security cooperation, of course, is possible, but on very limited terms and under very limited conditions, and definitely not when either European or Chinese soil is concerned to some extent. And regarding the Russian-Ukraine war, I think what is imaginable, what could happen, is some kind of cooperation between the EU and China on, as I said before, engaging within the United Nations framework, preparing the international environment to be conducive for peace talks, working towards a ceasefire, of course, if China is willing to engage more actively. But I think this could happen, but I don't see any kind of substantial security cooperation happening between the EU and China.
I could also pose another follow-up question to this. Given that the security is becoming an issue for the EU, especially in relation to China, don't you think that even that EU-China relation would not have that much of promise when it comes to security cooperation? How about this corporate, economic, and trade collaboration?
Yeah, I think this is a much more fruitful area to cooperate, because neither, in comparison to, I will start differently, neither the EU nor China is a relevant security actor in the world right now. So of course, it's much easier to cooperate on topics where you have an experience, where you are knowledgeable, and where you have a weight on the global stage. And this is true for trade and economics, both for the EU and for China, but it is not true for security. Neither the EU nor China is a relevant security player. They might both be emerging security players. There's a lot of discussions about China emerging as a global security player, also with regards to the Middle East, by the way. But right now, I don't see this happening in the near future. I think if China is becoming more of a security actor, this is because it seeks to create safe environments for its investments abroad, its investments overseas, also its diaspora working overseas. But in a lot of contexts, not at least in the Gulf region or in the Middle East, more broadly speaking, we see China being very hesitant to engage in or take sides in regional conflicts. China is still trying to have this very apolitical, economy-focused approach to a lot of its partners, and is remaining very hesitant to flank or even substitute the US as a security actor. So it's mainly, if there's a security component to China's foreign policy, it's mainly to secure own investments and its own people living overseas. Yeah.
Thank you. I do have a question. It's coming out from Jaman Shahrani, and he's asking this: don't you expect the European Union as a fragile union, evidence of the withdrawal of the United Kingdom and the Brexit? Probably in relation to the question, I would frame it: how comes that some people think the EU is facing some internal challenges, beginning with the UK is moving out of the Union. Wouldn't this impact positively or negatively the EU-China relation?
Okay, yeah, I think the question, the answer to the question, why do some people think that the EU is facing internal problems, is because the EU is facing a lot of internal problems. As the question has rightly asked or rightly pointed to, the Brexit is the culmination of the problems, of many of the problems that the European Union has had in the past years, which is a lack of internal cohesion, I would say. The EU consists of so many different member states that have very different needs, very different backgrounds, very different histories, even different values, although this is not a very favorable thing to say. So of course, this clashes sometimes, and it's very difficult to bring all this together. It is already very difficult to maintain a good bilateral relationship. Imagine how difficult it is to bring more than 20 states together and have kind of one position on some topics. That is very difficult. So the major problem that the EU has been struggling in the past years with is this lack of internal cohesion, the lack to find a common voice on a lot of questions. So I think, to answer the question that has been posed, yes, to some extent, I think the European Union is a fragile union, but I also think it is a union that has a lot of potential to become stronger.
We have another question from Fawaz. Do you think the balkanization of the world economy continue, and if does, Europe presumably could decline in the pecking order? Do you understand the question, Julie?
What is meant with pecking order?
We can. I probably try to frame the question. Do you think that Balkanization back in the Ottoman history, when the Balkanization has some issues, and then leaving out the Ottoman Empire lands, do you think probably the EU would experience somehow deconstruction among the member states? The UK is one example.
Very, very difficult question. I think, I mean, in the past years, we have seen similar tendencies as in the UK in many other European member states. There has been discussions in Greece, but also Hungary has distanced itself from Brussels, etc. So I don't think that we will experience something like a second Brexit, another country leaving the European Union. I don't think so. But definitely, there's a lot of internal struggles, a lot of countries that distance themselves from each other at the moment. So yes, this I certainly do see. But a second thing like the Brexit happening, no, I don't think this is going to happen. And I don't think that Europe somehow declines in the current order. I think Europe or the EU definitely will remain. And I mean, the fact that Ukraine also wants to join the European Union now and has signed the agreement for that also shows that the European Union, it's not just a normative construct. It's not just something that people want to happen, but it is a bond, and it is a cooperation unit, and it has some advantages to offer to its member states. And also this pooling of sovereignty, the whole founding ideas of the European Union, this is still attractive to states. So I think this will definitely go on despite all the internal challenges and conflicts that the EU is having.
Thank you, Julia. Coming to the second part of the presentation, or the middle part of the presentation, I would ask you, do you think that there is ways in which either the China EU could cooperate positively or negatively in the Middle East, and in specific the Gulf region?
Yes, I think there are ways the two sides could cooperate, but this would mean defining the respective own interests first. And I think this is something which this is a homework that both the EU and China need to do for the region. So I think it is not very clear for both sides what exactly are our interests in the region. And for cooperation, and I mean like robust cooperation beyond instances of reacting to certain happenings together, robust cooperation, maybe even with a strategy, this interests would need to be much clearer. And I think this is not the case now, neither for the EU nor for China. But I can imagine this happening. And I think the fact that China and the EU are very different actors and have very different things to offer could maybe, if I can be very optimistic here, could maybe lead to cooperation, with the EU being a very good mediator in a lot of settings. China bringing to the table a huge economic clout, and I think if one could bring this together in a very constructive way, of course this could lead to cooperation. But it really depends on the topic. As I said before, whether cooperation takes place, it's always a question of a common understanding of what one wants, and the systemic rivalries, the different ideas about modes of governance, about normative aspirations, etc. This is, of course, a major obstacle to cooperation. But this really depends on the policy field, or even different security issues. Yeah, I think I will leave it at that.
Don't you think that there could be possibly long-term economic developments and cooperation between China and the EU, especially in relation to coastal ports or like major economic projects?
I mean, if there was some way to kind of bring together or to cooperate more in bringing together the Belt and Road Initiative and its projects and the Global Gateway that was initiated, or at least suggested by the European Union in 2021 as an alternative connectivity strategy. If there was some way to bring this closer together, of course, there could be cooperation, longer term cooperation, also economically. But this would mean also aligning these two major connectivity strategies, because as I see it now, both are a little bit in competition with each other. And this, of course, would impede this kind of longer term cooperation on different projects. Yes.
In reference to the outbreak of the war between Russia and Ukraine, have you seen, or could you elaborate on how this outbreak of the war between Russia and Ukraine impacted EU-Chinese policy in the Middle East and the Gulf region?
How it impacted the relationship?
The relationship or potential cooperation on what happened next in the next few months.
Well, I think, as I said in my presentation, both sides, the EU and China, they will turn more towards Gulf countries. So there will be, if we want to pick up this word of the pivot, there will be a pivot to the Gulf. I think this is already happening. And this is, of course, a reaction to or a result from the war in Ukraine and from the mounting tensions and the sanctions against Russia. Of course, the EU needs to look for oil and gas resources, and China needs that too. So I think with the two sides turning more towards the Gulf region, of course, they will need to engage more with each other on finding their positions in this region. So yes, I think the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war will certainly intensify this. Yes.
I have also another question from anonymous attendee. And the question goes, didn't you think that one of the main causes of issues between EU and China, or EU and others, is that EU believes and insists on improve their values and principles as global values and principles again? Probably this is one of the human rights campaigns that happens once in a while on China or others. How do you situate this, whether it can impact negatively EU relation?
I mean, this is always the typical criticism that the EU is believing and insisting to impose its own values and principles as global values and principles. But more so, it is a criticism to the US, I think. But fair enough to pose this to the EU as well. I think to some extent this is true. Of course, this is what the EU has always done, especially with this claim to kind of be a normative power. I think this is what has happened all the time, and this is of course something that clashes with the Chinese approach. Because if China is doing business in other countries, loans that are given, for example, they don't come with some kind of strings attached. They don't come attached to requests for market reforms, for liberalization, for democratization. Whereas when the EU does that and gives loans to other countries, for example, in the global South, this very often comes attached with these reform requests. And I know that for a lot of countries that seek short-term or fast loans, the Chinese approach then is more attractive because it doesn't impose conditions on how to develop beyond this very project. It doesn't impose conditions on how to do politics, how to construct the model of governance, which norms to propose, etc. But I think that this can potentially also be very, very dangerous because, yes, Chinese loans, Chinese money does not come attached with certain strings, but what it can bring about is also supporting regimes that repress minorities in their own countries. So I think it is not necessarily a bad thing that the EU sometimes promotes these values, although of course I see the point of criticism and I see what can be difficult at that point.
Probably we could also ask an important question here, and this could be the last question before the end of this lecture. Where do you see the future of EU-China relation, especially when you emphasize that both two sides they act interdependently, and it's difficult for either of them to leave the other side? Could you shed light on the future of this relationship and the challenges of this relationship?
This is a $1 million question. It is huge, but I will try to give my 2 cents on it. I think what will happen is exactly what you just outlined. They will not stop engaging with each other just because they can't. And this has a lot of reasons, and economic entanglement is probably the most dominant one. The complex interdependencies that I have outlined, it's probably the most important and dominant one. But of course, there are also other reasons for that. We live in a very globalized world, and I think two powers that are that large in world politics, that important as the EU and China, regardless of how different they are, there's no way of not to engage with each other. And I think a good thing of the past 50 years of diplomatic relationship between China and the EU is that regardless of how deep tensions were, regardless of how deep the misunderstanding or how different certain positions were, they never stopped talking to each other. And I think this is a good thing, and this will continue. But still, they will struggle to find their positions vis-a-vis each other. And probably it will, if cooperation takes place, it will be on very small and very specific issues, whereas on the larger political topics, of course, differences will prevail. And this is also, of course, true, to go back to the last question concerning the EU's criticism at the human rights situation in Xinjiang and in China. So I think this will continue. Yes.
Thank you, Julia.
Very modest answer to a very big question, but
thank you. You did well. You did well. Thanks. We're almost done with the question. Do you still have a last comment before I end the lecture? No, I think all that is left to say for me is a very big thank you to everybody who was listening. This is a topic which is very much at my heart and at the core of my research. So I'm always very happy to talk about this, but it's also a very big topic. So of course, 1 hour is of course not enough to engage with it adequately. Thanks to you, Mohammed, for your wonderful moderation. It was really great talking to you. And yeah, thanks to everybody from the King Faisal Center for hosting me and for setting up this lecture. Thank you, everybody, and stay safe and stay healthy, and hope to see you in person one day, inshallah. Thank you, Julia. With that and the time limit we have, I would like to thank Julia again for her participation and presentation of her thoughts, which enlighten us more about the subject. Thanks also to the audience who engaged with us during the event. For more information about the work and the project of the Asian Studies Program and other research units and the center, please visit its website, and you may also subscribe to the center email newsletter and to be updated for future events and publications. And we'll see you all in other events organized by the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies. Thank you once again for joining us, and I wish you all a good day. Thank you.